Part 2. The night stretched on, each mile bringing them farther from the house, but John's unease never left him. He kept his eyes locked on the road, the headlights illuminating the dark path ahead. His mind was racing, replaying the events over and over. Rex, the creature, the fear that had gripped their hearts. The farther they drove, the more the weight of their escape pressed down on him. Luke sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window, his brow furrowed with worry. Eli, too, hadn't said much since they left. His eyes were glassy, as if he was trying to hold it all together. But John knew the pain of leaving Rex behind was too much for him. It was too much for all of them. "We're almost there," John said, breaking the silence. He didn't know who he was trying to reassure, Emma, the boys, or himself. They had driven for hours, and he could already see the lights of a small town up ahead. "Where are we going?" Emma asked softly, her voice almost lost in the sound of the car's engine. John took a deep breath before answering. "We'll stop in this town, get some rest, and then head back to our old state first thing in the morning. We need to regroup, figure out what to do next." Emma didn't respond, but John could feel her eyes on him. She was worried, just like he was. They hadn't talked about what happened, not in detail, but they both knew the gravity of their situation. The creature, whatever it was, had shown them no mercy, and they still didn't know what it wanted. As they drove into the town, John saw a small motel off the side of the road. He turned the car into the parking lot and pulled to a stop. The building looked run down, the lights flickering above the entrance. But it didn't matter. It was a place to rest, to breathe, and maybe, just maybe, a place to figure out their next move. "Stay in the car. I'll check us in," John said, already opening the door. Emma nodded, her eyes full of fatigue and worry. "Hurry, John. Please." John walked inside the motel's office, the bell above the door ringing softly as he entered. The woman behind the counter barely glanced up at him as he approached. She was older, her graying hair pulled back into a bun, and she looked tired, as if she'd seen too many weary travelers pass through her doors. "Just a room for the night," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. "A room for 4. The woman handed him a key without a word, and John thanked her before heading back to the car. He felt an odd chill in the air as he walked back, and when he reached the door, he glanced over his shoulder. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something was watching him. "Everything okay?" Emma asked when he got back into the car. "Yeah, we're good," John replied, trying to sound normal. "We've got a room for the night. Let's get some rest. We'll figure it out tomorrow." As they checked into the room, John tried to push the thought of Rex from his mind, but it was difficult. The image of the creature dragging the dog away was burned into his memory, a haunting reminder of the danger they had barely escaped. They all settled into the room, the boys collapsing onto the bed, exhausted from the day's events. Emma was still quiet, lost in her own thoughts, but John could tell she was just as haunted by the night's horrors as he was. The room was small, but it would have to do for now. John locked the door, checking the locks twice. Then he sat in the chair by the window, his gaze fixed on the empty road outside. The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, just like the unknown that lay ahead of them. "John?" Emma said quietly from the bed. "Do you think it's over?" John hesitated before answering. "I don't know, Emma. I wish I could say yes, but I don't think it's over. I think it's just the beginning." The morning after they left the motel, John drove his family back toward the small town they'd moved to, a town that was still unfamiliar, still haunted by the strange events they had faced. The distance from the house hadn't eased the sense of dread. It followed them like an invisible shadow, heavy and unshakable. "Dad," Luke said quietly from the back seat, his voice tired. "Are we going back to the house?" John glanced at the rearview mirror, catching the worried expression on his son's face. "Yes, Luke. We need to go back." The drive felt long. With every mile, John's mind raced through the nightmarish events they'd experienced. The creature, Rex gone, the fear that gripped them all. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just running from the house. They were running from something much darker, something that had attached itself to them. As they pulled into the town, Emma, sitting beside him in the front seat, broke the silence. "Do you think we'll find Rex?" Her voice trembled, but John knew she wasn't just talking about the dog. She was asking if they could find anything at all that made sense in this nightmare. I don't know, Emma, John replied, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. But we can't leave him. We have to go back. They reached the house, and the familiar sight of it did nothing to ease the tension building inside John. The house loomed ahead, isolated and eerie against the backdrop of the thick forest surrounding it. The windows stared at them like empty eyes, and a chill swept through him. "We're here," John said, his voice low as he turned off the engine. They all got out of the car in silence. The air felt thick, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. The house that had seemed so perfect when they'd first seen it was now just a shell of a home, empty and menacing. John moved toward the door, but as soon as he touched the handle, he froze. A soft growl came from the trees nearby, followed by a rustling noise, something large moving through the brush. His heart pounded in his chest. They weren't alone. "Did you hear that?" Eli whispered, his voice barely audible. John nodded. He had heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something watching them. "Stay close," John said, his voice tight. The fear he'd been trying to suppress was creeping up his spine, threatening to overwhelm him. "We need to get inside." The family moved quickly, but before they could make it inside the house, something caught their attention. A dark figure moving in the edge of the trees. It was large, but not like a bear, not like a person. It was hunched over, almost crawling on all fours, its eyes gleaming in the shadows. "Stay inside," John told Emma, his voice sharp. He could feel his heart racing in his chest as he pushed her toward the door. "Lock it. Don't open it for anyone." The rest of them, John, Luke, and Eli, stood frozen in place, staring at the figure. The creature didn't move for a moment, its eyes fixed on them. And then, in a flash, it disappeared into the trees. "I don't like this," Luke said, his voice trembling. He stood next to John, but his eyes were wide with fear. John's mind was spinning. They had barely made it through the night before, and now it was happening again. He couldn't let the creature get any closer. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "We have to find Rex," John said, his voice low and steady, though he felt the panic rising again. "We can't leave him here. We have to go after him." The thought of returning into the woods, into the unknown, was terrifying, but John knew there was no other option. They couldn't leave their dog behind, and they couldn't run from whatever was lurking in the forest. "Stay close, and don't make a sound," John ordered. They made their way into the trees, the shadows growing darker as they moved deeper into the woods. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence, twigs snapping underfoot, the faint rustle of leaves. As they ventured deeper, they found nothing. No signs of Rex, no sign of the creature. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. But John knew they couldn't stop. They couldn't give up. "We'll find him," John said to his sons, though his voice lacked the confidence he hoped to convey. They all knew they were walking into danger, but they didn't have a choice. Rex had to be out here somewhere. John, Luke, and Eli moved cautiously through the dense woods, their feet crunching on dry leaves and twigs. The trees around them seemed to loom taller, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The chill in the air made it harder to breathe, and every time a branch rustled or the wind howled, they jumped, afraid it was the creature returning. "Where do you think he could be?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His wide eyes scanned the darkness, and John could see the fear reflected in them. "I don't know," John replied, trying to sound calm, though his nerves were fraying. He wanted to believe they would find Rex, but the longer they searched, the more hopeless it seemed. "We just have to keep looking." Luke stayed close to his father, his eyes darting from tree to tree. "Do you think the creature took him?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear. "I mean, what if Rex is?" John held up a hand, silencing him. "We don't know that. We're not going to jump to conclusions." But even as he said it, doubt crept into his mind. What else could it have been? What other creature could move like that, like it wasn't even human? Suddenly, a soft whine broke the tense silence. The sound was distant but unmistakable. "Rex?" Luke said, his voice urgent. He pushed forward, his feet stumbling in his hurry to follow the sound. "That's him! I hear him!" John's heart raced as he motioned for the boys to stay close. They quickened their pace, moving toward the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. The closer they got, the more intense the growls of the creature from the previous night seemed to echo in his mind. Could it be watching them now, waiting for them to get closer? The whine grew louder, followed by a faint bark. John's pulse quickened. They were close. He could feel it. They pushed through the underbrush and came to a clearing. In the center of it, lying on the ground, was Rex. The dog looked weak and disoriented, his fur matted with dirt and blood. He whined again as they approached, but didn't try to run. "Rex!" Eli called out, rushing toward the dog. He knelt beside him, running his hands through Rex's fur. "What happened to you, boy?" John's eyes scanned the area, his nerves on high alert. He felt like they were being watched, but there was no sign of the creature. No movement, no sounds. Just the eerie stillness of the forest surrounding them. "What do you think happened to him?" Luke asked, crouching down beside his brother. "I don't know," John replied, "but we need to get him back to the house. He's not safe here." Eli gently helped Rex stand, though the dog seemed weak and unsteady. He leaned into Eli's side, trusting him for support. "We're going to get you home, Rex," Eli whispered, his voice full of concern. But as they began to turn back toward the house, something shifted in the shadows. A movement, fast, fleeting, and just out of sight. John froze, his heart pounding. The creature was close. He could feel it. It was just waiting for them to make a mistake. "Stay close," John said in a low voice, his hand tightening around the handle of the flashlight he carried. "Don't stray from me." They moved quickly but carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made John's pulse spike. It wasn't just the fear of the creature that haunted him now. It was the feeling that something was always just behind them, just waiting for the right moment to strike. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the edge of the woods and saw the outline of the house in the distance. John breathed a sigh of relief. But as they approached the door, the fear remained. "Emma," John called, his voice strained. "We found him. We're back." Emma rushed to the door, relief flooding her face when she saw Rex in Eli's arms. She ran forward, kneeling to check on the dog. "Oh, Rex," Emma whispered, her hands shaking as she gently petted the dog's fur. "What happened to you?" John's eyes searched the woods behind them, his heart still racing. The creature hadn't followed them, at least not yet, but he knew they weren't out of danger. "Let's get inside," John said firmly, ushering everyone into the house. Once they were inside, he locked the door, his back pressed against it as he took a deep breath. They were safe, for now. Once inside, John made sure the doors and windows were securely locked. He didn't speak, but his mind raced, replaying the last few hours. The feeling of being watched still clung to him like a weight, and he couldn't shake the image of the creature lurking just beyond their reach. Emma sat with Rex, gently rubbing his back as Eli and Luke gathered around him. The dog's body trembled, and his eyes were wide with fear. He clearly wasn't the same dog that had left the house with them that morning. Something had happened to him in the woods, something terrible. "Rex will be okay," Emma murmured, though her voice lacked the conviction she tried to project. "He just needs rest." But John knew better. This wasn't just about the dog. There was something far worse at play here, something far more dangerous than they could comprehend. "We're not safe here," John said, breaking the silence. His voice was heavy with the weight of the truth he couldn't ignore any longer. Emma looked up at him, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've only been here a few days, and already—" "This," John said, gesturing to the still, silent house, the forest beyond, and the creature that seemed to be waiting just outside their door. "I don't know how long we can stay here." Emma stood up, her brow furrowed. "But where would we go, John?" "We don't have anywhere else. We already left everything behind to start fresh here." John ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth. "I know, but this isn't a fresh start. This place, it's cursed. There's something wrong with it." Luke stood up from where he'd been sitting with Eli and Rex. "Maybe we should just leave. Get in the car and go back to the old house, or even somewhere else. We can't stay here." John turned to his son, the fear evident in his eyes. "I wish it was that easy, Luke, but every time I try to leave, something pulls me back here. I can't explain it, but I can feel it. The house, it doesn't want us to leave." Eli, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Maybe it's not the house, Maybe it's the forest? It's something in there, isn't it? John's heart skipped a beat. Eli's words were like a cold breath against his neck. He didn't want to acknowledge what his son had just said, but deep down, he knew Eli was right. Yeah, John said softly. I think it's the forest. Rex whined again from where he lay on the floor, his body twitching with every sound. He was clearly shaken, and though he had made it back with them, the creature that had taken him, or whatever had happened in those woods, had left an indelible mark on him. We have to stay alert, John said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying urgency. Tonight, we sleep in shifts. We can't let our guard down, not until we figure out what we're dealing with. The rest of the family nodded, though none of them felt truly safe. They huddled together, keeping the lights dim and the house quiet. They couldn't afford to be heard, not with whatever was out there, lurking in the dark. As night fell, the atmosphere in the house grew thick with tension. The wind outside howled like a distant warning, and the trees seemed to sway ominously, as though they were alive, listening, waiting for something. John stayed by the door, watching the shadows. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind sent his heart into overdrive. He wasn't sure what they were up against, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was far from over. Suddenly, there was a soft scratching sound at the window, faint but unmistakable. John's heart jumped in his chest. He motioned for everyone to be silent, and they froze, listening. There was nothing, only the wind. And then, the scratching came again, louder this time, followed by a low growl. Something was out there. Something was circling the house. John's eyes darted to the window. The creature was close. He could feel it. Stay quiet, John whispered, his voice a strained rasp. Don't make a sound. The scratching continued, and then it stopped. The house fell into an eerie silence, but John knew it wasn't over. Whatever it wasn't going to stop until it had them. And as he stood there, watching the darkened window, he could feel the weight of the danger pressing in on them from all sides. The scratching at the door had stopped, but the feeling of dread lingered in the air like a suffocating cloud. John stood at the door, eyes fixed on the darkness outside, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever that creature was, it was still out there, and he wasn't about to risk his family's safety. We need to leave, John said suddenly, his voice hoarse but determined. Emma turned to him, her face pale. What? Where will we go? We can't stay here, John. We've barely been here a few days. I don't care, John said, his words coming out in a rush. We can't stay here another night. Whatever is out there, it's not going to stop until it has us. Luke and Eli both looked up at their father, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. But we just got here, Luke said, his voice trembling. Why can't we just stay? Because it's not safe, John snapped. We're not staying here, Luke. We're leaving. Now. The urgency in John's voice left no room for argument. He quickly moved to pack up a few things, and Emma followed him, pulling Eli close as she hurried to gather their belongings. Rex, sensing the panic, whimpered softly from where he lay, still visibly shaken from the earlier events. Within minutes, the family was ready to go. John grabbed the keys, and without another word, they piled into the car. The engine roared to life, and they sped away from the house, leaving the small town behind them. As they drove down the empty road, the weight of the situation pressed on them. They had left their new home, their fresh start, behind. But John didn't care anymore. They were going back to their old life, to the familiarity and safety of their previous home. The road stretched ahead of them, the familiar trees and fields of the old state, comforting them as they drove further away from the town that had become a nightmare. The tension in the car slowly started to ease, but no one spoke. They all knew that they couldn't forget what had happened in that small town. After a long drive, they finally arrived at a gas station in a sleepy little town. John pulled over to fuel up, trying to ignore the creeping feeling that still hadn't left him. As he filled the tank, Emma and the boys stepped inside to grab some snacks. The gas station was old, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. A couple of locals were sitting at the counter, chatting quietly as they drank coffee. John followed them inside, still feeling on edge, but he knew they couldn't stay in the car forever. He overheard a conversation as he approached the counter. Two men were talking in hushed tones, but the words made John's stomach turn. You hear about those people who went missing? one of the men said, shaking his head. Animals, too. No one knows what's going on, but it's been happening a lot lately. The other man nodded grimly. Yeah, people have been disappearing for weeks now. Dogs, cats, whole families. It's not just in this town either. It's spread across the whole area. John felt a chill run down his spine. He exchanged a quick glance with Emma, who had heard the conversation too. Her face was pale, her hand instinctively reaching for Rex, who had been quiet the entire trip. Missing? John muttered under his breath. How is that possible? What's going on? One of the men caught his eye and raised an eyebrow. Oh, you're not from around here, are you? No, John replied, his voice tight. We just moved here, but we're leaving. He stopped himself, unsure how to explain the terror they had just fled. It's not for us. The man nodded knowingly, as if he'd heard this before. Well, maybe you're better off gone then. People don't come back after they disappear, and it's only getting worse. John's stomach churned as he finished filling the car and quickly paid for the gas. He didn't want to hear any more. It was as if the town itself was cursed, a place where people vanished without a trace. The drive back to their old house felt longer than before. No one said anything. They just wanted to get home, to forget everything that had happened. When they finally arrived at their old house, they felt a strange sense of relief. They were safe, at least for now. They settled in, unpacking their things and trying to return to normal. But deep down, John couldn't shake the feeling that they had just narrowly escaped something far worse than they realized. The next few days passed in a strange sort of haze. John, Emma, Luke, Eli, and Rex settled back into their old home as if nothing had happened. The familiar walls of the house felt like a protective shield, keeping the terrifying memories of the past town at bay. But despite the comfort of returning home, something was different. John couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was wrong, something he hadn't fully understood yet. Emma was quiet, her smile forced as she went about the usual routine. Luke and Eli were more reserved, clearly still unsettled by their recent experience. Even Rex, usually so playful, seemed subdued. On the 5th day after their return, John decided to look up the house they had bought in the small town. It had been a good deal, too good, and he needed to know more about it. He sat down at his computer, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He typed the address into the search bar. There was nothing. No listings. No news stories. He even checked the local archives from the small town they had moved to. Still nothing. It was as if the house had never existed at all. He tried searching the area around it. Nothing. It was as if the whole town was gone, wiped from the map. A sinking feeling settled in his chest as he went through each link and article, but there was no trace of the house, no mention of any family ever living there. It was like they had never been there. John rubbed his eyes in disbelief. He knew it wasn't just his imagination. The house, the town, it had all been real, hadn't it? The strange figures in the woods, the werewolf that haunted their every step. How could all of that just disappear? He opened a new tab and searched for the town's name, the one where they had been living. But when he hit enter, all that appeared was a message. This page no longer exists. His heart raced. He tried again, using different sources, but the results were the same. The town didn't exist anymore, as if it had been erased from history. John? What's wrong? Emma's voice startled him, and he turned to see her standing in the doorway. Her eyes were wide, concern etched on her face. I don't know, he said quietly, standing up. I'm looking up the house. I can't find anything about it, or the town. It's like it never existed. Emma's face drained of color as she stepped into the room. What do you mean? Never existed? The town, the house. We lived there. We were there. I know, John replied, but I can't find any trace of it. It's like it was all erased. No record of the house, no town, no people. They stood there, both silent, unsure of what to make of it. How could they have been so sure about everything? About the house, the creatures, the strange feeling they had when they left. And now, everything was gone? The air in the room felt colder, the familiar surroundings of their old home suddenly feeling alien and distant. John's mind raced as he thought back to that place. The woods, the werewolf, the missing people and animals. It was all connected. He was certain of it. But what was it? Why had they been drawn there, only to have everything vanish once they left? Maybe we should just forget about it. What Emma suggested, her voice barely a whisper. Maybe Maybe it's better that way. Just leave it behind. John nodded slowly, but in his heart, he couldn't shake the unease. Something about it all didn't add up. And yet, as he looked at Emma's weary face, he realized she might be right. Maybe some things were better left forgotten. The family spent the next few days trying to settle back into their routine, trying to block out the strange memories. But the feeling of unease never quite left John. There were moments when he'd look out the window, half expecting to see the shadowy figures in the woods. But there was nothing, just the quiet, peaceful landscape they had once known. The weeks that followed their return to the old house were marked by an uneasy calm. John tried to put the events behind him, but the more he thought about it, the harder it was to ignore the questions that kept popping up. The town, the house, the terrifying creatures in the woods, everything had just vanished without a trace. He spent hours online searching for any hint, any sign of what had happened. But it was as if the entire chapter of their lives had been erased from history. No matter how hard he searched, nothing came up. At night, when the house was quiet and the family was asleep, John would sit at his desk staring at the blank screen. The more he looked for answers, the more he felt like he was slipping into a void, an abyss that had swallowed up everything about the town they had lived in. One night, as he was about to shut down his computer, his phone buzzed. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. The message was short but chilling. The house is still there. The town hasn't forgotten. John stared at the screen, feeling a cold shiver run down his spine. Who could have sent this? And what did it mean? He tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. A sense of dread settled in his chest as he thought back to everything they had experienced. Had they truly escaped? Or was it just the beginning of something even darker? Meanwhile, Emma noticed the change in John. She had seen how unsettled he'd been ever since their return, but now it seemed worse. He hardly slept, and when he did, he tossed and turned. His eyes were constantly darting toward the woods behind the house, as though he were expecting something to appear at any moment. "John, you need to stop. This is starting to take a toll on you," Emma said one evening as they sat together in the living room. She gently placed her hand on his. "We need to let go of it. We've made it out, and we're safe. That's all that matters." John looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and unease. "I can't shake it, Emma. Something doesn't feel right. It's like the whole town was hiding something. Like it was just waiting for us to leave." Emma sighed, trying to stay calm. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you. We've been through a lot, but we're here now and we're okay." But John wasn't convinced. He couldn't ignore the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edges of their life, something that wasn't finished with them yet. The next day, John took a trip to the nearby town's library. He knew it was a long shot, but maybe, just maybe, there would be something there. A clue, a record, anything that could explain the mystery of the house and the town. He spent hours combing through old newspapers, archives, and town records. But again, there was nothing. Not a single mention of the town they had lived in. It was as if it had never existed. Just as he was about to give up and leave, he overheard a conversation between two older women at a nearby table. They were talking in low voices, but their words sent a chill down John's spine. "You ever hear about that family that moved out to the old town a few years ago?" one of the women asked. The other woman nodded, looking around as though she was worried someone might overhear. "I heard they disappeared, vanished without a trace. No one ever found out what happened to them." John's heart raced. "What do you mean, vanished?" he asked, stepping forward. The women looked at him with surprise. "Oh, you're new around here, aren't you? It was a few years ago. A family moved into that house out by the woods, the one everyone avoids. After they left, the town just went quiet. Nothing was ever the same again." John felt his breath catch in his throat. Was this about the house they had bought? The same one he had tried to search for, only to find it erased from existence? "Why did they leave?" John asked, his voice tense. The first woman lowered her voice. "Some say they were warned. Others say they just couldn't take it anymore. Something about the woods, the people who lived there. Whatever happened, they never came back." The conversation trailed off, but John's mind was racing. He had to know more. But the women quickly stood up and left, leaving him standing there in the dimly lit library, feeling like a piece of the puzzle was finally falling into place. After hearing the conversation in the library, John was filled with a sense of urgency. He had to get answers. The strange disappearance of the family, the eerie silence surrounding the house, everything was starting to make sense. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a simple forgotten town. Later that evening, after dinner, John gathered his family together in the living room. Emma, Luke, Eli, and Rex were all there, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of everything they'd been through. "I don't think we can move on from this," John said, his voice low but determined. "Something's not right. I spoke with some people in the library today, and it seems like the town, the house we lived in, it's like it was erased. People remember us, but there's no record of the place, and they say that family, they disappeared." Emma's face paled, and Luke and Eli exchanged nervous glances. Rex, lying by the fireplace, lifted his head, sensing the tension. "What do you mean they disappeared?" Eli asked cautiously. "They were a family who moved into the house before us," John replied. "They left without warning, and no one knows what happened to them. Some people think they were warned off. Others say they just couldn't handle it anymore." "We can't keep running from it," Emma said quietly, her voice steady, but her eyes filled with concern. "We need to focus on moving forward, not looking back." "I agree with Emma," Luke added, though his voice lacked conviction. He was still uneasy about the entire situation. John nodded slowly. "I know, but I can't let this go. We need to figure out what's really going on. Maybe we can go back to the town, check it out one more time." The family fell silent, the idea of returning to the place that had haunted their every step for so long seeming both terrifying and inevitable. Part 19. A Shattered Return. The decision was made. John would take the family back to the small town. He couldn't shake the thought that there was something he had missed, something that was still hidden. Emma, reluctantly, agreed, though she made it clear that this would be the last time they set foot in that place. The drive back was tense, filled with an eerie silence. Luke and Eli sat in the back seat, clutching Rex, who seemed unusually quiet as well. Emma kept her eyes on the road, occasionally glancing at John, who seemed lost in thought. As they approached the outskirts of the town, the landscape seemed strangely familiar, yet unsettling. The forest loomed to the side, dark and foreboding, as if it were hiding something they weren't meant to see. When they reached the town, John parked in front of the old cafe where they had stopped during their first visit. It looked exactly the same, unchanged, untouched by time. He couldn't help but feel like something was watching them, hidden just out of sight. The family walked toward the cafe, their footsteps echoing in the empty street. The door opened with a creak, and they stepped inside. It was quiet, the air thick with a musty scent, as if the place hadn't been touched in years. The same old biker was sitting at the counter, staring at his drink with a vacant expression. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing as he recognized them. "Well, look who's back," he muttered, his voice gravely. "I thought you'd learned your lesson." John's heart sank. "What do you mean?" The biker gave a bitter laugh. "You don't get it, do you? This town, it's not like other places. It was never meant to be remembered. But you tried to take something from it, and now it's never going to let you go." John's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" The biker's eyes gleamed with a strange intensity. "You weren't supposed to leave. The house, the town, it was all a trap, a test. You think you're safe? You think you've escaped? It's watching you, and one day, it'll come for you again." Before John could respond, the biker stood up and walked toward the back of the cafe, disappearing into the shadows. The eerie feeling lingered in the air long after they left the diner. John, Emma, Luke, Eli, and Rex drove out of the small town, the words of the old biker echoing in their minds. "Worst deal of your life," he'd said, but it was no longer just a joke. There was something about the town, the house, the forest. It all felt wrong. As they crossed the town limits, a silent agreement passed between them. They would never return. As the miles stretched between them and the town, the weight that had been pressing on their shoulders seemed to ease. John gripped the wheel with a newfound determination. He would not let this experience haunt them any longer. The family deserved peace, and that meant leaving everything behind. "We're done with that place," John finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was firm, but beneath it was the quiet relief of letting go. "We'll never go back." Emma nodded silently, her hand resting on Luke's shoulder as he sat in the back seat, his head against the window. Eli, unusually quiet, held on to Rex, who was curled up beside him. It was as if the decision had lifted something heavy off their hearts. The town, the house, the strange creatures, everything would stay behind in the rearview mirror. As they drove through the winding roads, they passed no more reminders of the town they had just left. It was fading from their memory with each passing mile. They made no more stops, didn't look back, didn't even speak of what had happened. It was as though they had agreed, without ever saying it out loud, that it was over. They would leave that chapter of their lives closed and locked away, never to be reopened. The long drive felt calming, almost like a cleansing. When they finally reached their old home, there was no talk of the strange house, the fears, or the darkness that had plagued them. They simply carried on with their lives, starting fresh in the place where they had always felt safe. They never spoke of the strange town again. And as time went on, the memory of it began to fade, like a forgotten dream. The family settled into their routine, building new memories without any trace of what had happened. They never discussed the weird figures in the woods, the fear they felt, or the strange atmosphere of that place. In 2007, John briefly searched the internet for any trace of the house they had lived in, but found nothing. The address was gone, no information, no mention of it anywhere. It was as though the house, the town, and the experience had never existed. He closed the search window with a quiet sigh, content that the past was gone for good. And so, the family lived on, happy and undisturbed, never looking back at the place they had left behind. They had found peace once more in the present, and they had no intention of ever returning to the past. The end. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories.